Okay, so what do you know about the book To Kill a Mockingbird?
To Kill a Mockingbird is a book that I teach routinely. I first encountered it, I think, like many people, kind of as a middle school kid. I just read it on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Then I grew up in Texas, and we had a program like our high school English, so it was taught in the ninth grade.
Okay.
So I had officially, in that context. And then I went on. Undergraduate, it was not taught to me, but I went to graduate school and I was doing Southern studies, Southern literary studies, and I was doing it at Vanderbilt, and it was a really interesting place to think about To Kill a Mockingbird because the old school there of the professors deemed it not fit to be taught. That it was
Oh.
children's literature, it was juvenilia. Newer generations, of course, and thinking about shifting canons, were like, but this is one of the novels that has become so widely read, so widely taught that we need to be thinking about it in scholarly context. So it was actually one of the books that I wrote on in my dissertation,
Oh, wow.
and then that has become part of a book chapter looking at the way kind of gender and sexuality are handled in To Kill a Mockingbird. I think usually, if we go back to why the book might be banned, it's dealing with issues of race.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that it's going to be either frankly dealing with race, particularly race in the context of allegations of interracial rape. That Mayella Ewell, has really, accused Tom Robinson of that. Or that it is a work that, in its critique of racism, sometimes replicates a racist language. I mean, so the word nigger, for instance, is used
Mm-hmm.
there, but usually to interrogate the problems of that. And I've routinely taught it. I teach it sometimes in Southern literature classes. I sometimes teach it in American fiction classes. Here at Mary Washington, one is post 1950. So it's as you know, a very conventionally written novel. It's very traditional. And so I sometimes will pair To Kill a Mockingbird with a radical postmodern novel as far as form. I once paired it with Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49,
Mm-hmm.
which is wildly experimental. So both coming out in the early 60s. And then most recently, I've taught it in a writing about the South class.
Okay.
So I've got an intimate relationship with To Kill a
Yay,
Mockingbird.
awesome. That's like one of my questions was like, do you teach it in
Yeah.
courses here? So awesome. What kind of themes about the book do you talk about in those classes?
Yeah, couple of them. I would say that before I get to themes and content, as I mentioned with contrasting it to Pynchon, I look at form. As a person who teaches literary history, I want my students to think about the structure, the feel of the novel. So we talk about point of view and narration, that it's the adult scout remembering her
Mm-hmm.
childhood, and kind of how that's a tricky thing because it adds a sense of intimacy, but it's also kind of a deliberate performed naivete that when Scout is telling this, it's as if she's in the moment, not as an adult woman.
Mm-hmm.
So that it manipulates us. Most readers find Scout way sympathetic, that she's such a sympathetic narrator. But then as far as themes, we talk about racial justice. But that too has been kind of critiqued, is that the themes of racial justice are so heavy-handed
Mm-hmm.
that it is. That's why it's usually taught in middle school or ninth grade, is that it's don't be racist. Got it, check.
Yeah.
But a ninth grader can feel good about his analytic skills when they get that. There's also concern. This is frequently arisen from African American critics, that it is a novel that minimizes black agency. I mean, so that Tom Robinson is both physically handicapped. Remember, his arm has been mangled in a gin accident, and then he's killed. I mean, ultimately, when he's running away. So the hero of the novel, of course, is Atticus Finch.
Yeah.
For some people, that is problematic, that you've got the upper class, straight, white, male lawyer is the one who will condescend to defend African Americans. So where's black agency? It's kind of the kindness and condescension of white people. So that's one of the critiques of it. But I also talk about gender and sexuality, also talk about small town life, how it's represented. I'm trying to think of any other themes that I do. Those are the big ones of race, gender, and sexuality.
Awesome. So you said you don't know a whole lot about like the book being challenged or banned.
Yeah, I don't. I just know that it frequently is on banned books list. I don't know specifics, but I suspect it's usually because of the way it handles race, the presence of rape, and the presence of derogatory language.
Yeah, so what we found through our research is that most of the time, especially in the last 15, 20 years, that it's challenged because of language.
Yeah.
That's the big one.
Sure.
And that's the case that we're looking at in Accomack County. That's why it was big. That's why they pulled it off the shelves.
Sure.
Was because of language. And so we were wondering, because some people argue that the language is necessary to show the racial prejudice at the time. And so I was going to ask, do you think it's necessary in the book itself, or is it something that's unnecessary?
I come at this from the perspective of Southern literature. So derogatory language is used repeatedly, and particularly the word nigger. That is the word that is most fraught, and it invariably prompts very careful course discussions, in my classes, so that I think I often have to negotiate, is that word allowable? Is it allowed if it's only during quotations? How is it? And so it literally came up. I'm doing a Writing About the South class this semester, and only had one African American student in the class, and we were reading Gone with the Wind, in which that word is also used. There, in a much more pejorative context, in a way that Mitchell is racist, in a way that I think Harper Lee was not. And so when the student came to me, we went to the classes. Okay, how are we going to negotiate this word? And in the arguments that were put forth, some of the students defending the discussion of the word is that because it is so powerful, it has such a racialized, derogatory punch, we need to be reading literature that makes us have these discussions. The discussions are not useful, but it's also a reminder that language hurts, and so that when we see this, that's why I would say someone like Harper Lee wants to put it in there. It's not just that, yes, it's historically accurate, for the 1950s when she was writing it, the 1930s when she's setting this, but it's a way that word has punch. I mean, and writers have always done that. You go back to Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, and the first version was 1845. He too uses that word, but he uses to expose in all of the ways that African American slaves were oppressed. It was not just physically and emotionally, but linguistically. So that in one passage, he talks about when he's working in the shipyards, how at first there's a degree of honoring his autonomy, that he's Frederick, he's Fred, when people refer to him. As it goes on, he then gets referred to as boy and eventually as nigger, the way that it is a word that dehumanizes. So for him, I think Douglass was absolutely, that word needs to be there. I would say Lee probably felt the same way. It's not gratuitous because it's a novel about race and racism. So it's not, but that said, I understand why people are made uncomfortable by it. In my opinion, in the United States in the 21st century, we have a hard time talking about race. And this kind of puts it in our faces.
Thank you. The other question I had was, because you know a lot about the literature at the time, this book, I know that it they put it out there, and it became like this big success
Yeah.
because of like what it did.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, like, what from your knowledge, what did it do for the social aspect at
Yeah.
the time and the literary aspect of the time?
It's part of a whole series of Southern writers, white Southern writers at the time, who really were trying to join in kind of the discourses of the civil rights movement. But at the same time, it's a safe novel. We've just been focusing on, the way that the derogatory language makes it uncomfortable for some people. On the other hand, as I suggested way before that, it's a safe way of handling racial injustice, that it is through orderly means, it is through a lawyer, through a white man, etc. So I think that's why it became so popular. It is a novel that makes white people feel good.
Yeah.
And in the 1960s, many liberals, white liberals, north, south, wherever, that really spoke to them. So as you probably know, Harper Lee had written various kind of drafts before this, including Go Set a Watchman, which was published 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I think it's like 2015, 3 years ago.
And there, it's much more troubling, and Atticus Finch is racist. He's a member of the Klan, or at least white supremacist groups.
Yeah.
That was considered, well, one, it was a bad novel. The way that it was written, it was the adult Scout kind of talking about her experiences. And so Lee, working with her editors, changed it to make Scout more palatable, that childhood Scout's voice, and made it less controversial. So I think that's one of the reasons it was so successful in 1960, 61, I can't remember which year.
1961, so that's why it was, that makes a lot of sense.
And there were lots of other novels that were coming out roughly at the same time. Carson McCullers was writing novels that having to do with race at the same time, and much more graphic, and they were not nearly as successful.
Okay. So the argument, especially in the case that we're looking at, is that this book shouldn't be taught in schools anymore because of the language, and that we should offer more sensitive materials for students who are uncomfortable with the book. And I was wondering, do you think it should still be taught in high schools, in middle schools, or is it like, has it become to this point where it's like problematic to teach this?
I am a person who advocates teaching problems. So I understand that it can be a very sensitive, it can raise sensitive issues. I do worry a little bit about kind of snowflake environments, where we protect students. Now, I think it needs to have a teacher who is going to who handles this carefully. That it's a novel, I think, like many novels, that can be abused and be taught. So I think it still is useful to teach. I think because it is such an easy read, it's a read in which students often care about these characters. And what I find is that in the 21st century, in a digital age, it's hard to get students to read anything lengthy. So if To Kill a Mockingbird gets them to read, yes, having this problematic language and representation of race may raise some tensions in the classroom, but I think it's a novel that students might actually get invested in. I also worry a little bit about the classroom creating a space that no longer acknowledges the reality out there. Yes, we might not use derogatory language, the word nigger, in the classroom, but if a student goes on the street, she or he might be called that. That we want students to have safe learning environments, but we don't want them not to be reminded of the realities that they're dealing with. And I think To Kill a Mockingbird, like other texts, can do that productively. Remind that this is the reality. We still live in a racist world, and it's a little bit ironic to me to be reading a novel about race that actually edits out some of the harshness of racism in our discussions. Yeah,
I found that like one of the complaint is for the parent, from the parent to the Accomack County School, was that like her son hears it enough, like on the street.
Yeah. Okay.
And she was like, she said, my son hears this enough in the street, and this, like, to her, it makes it okay to say these words in the classroom, even though that's not really what they're going for.
Right.
It's just they want to talk about this, and so I thought that was really interesting.
The student who came to me in my class this semester raised much the same thing. She's like, I come from a household where that word is not allowed, and it just makes me uncomfortable hearing it. And for me as a professor, using that word, even if I'm only quoting it, even if I'm only kind of referring to this is how Mitchell used it, even to point out the racism, it still has the potential ability to be condoned by having an authority figure use it. And so this is where I said earlier about teachers needing to be very careful if they're teaching this, is you have to articulate, this is how we're using this word, this is how it is not being deployed to reinforce racism, but rather to expose racism, to remind us of racism. But I see that parent's argument, definitely. There can be, though, I also worry about a little bit of a slippery slope, because if we have, say, that word bracketed off in the classroom, well, another student might advocate for another word that is problematic to her. So we're right now in the same class, we're watching the film Moonlight, and the word faggot is used. And a student actually raises our discussion about the word nigger, is like, well, does faggot have the same resonance? What I thought was good was that we actually talked about that. Again, we got to come back to, this is the power that language has. And so that mother who's raising the concern, I don't want my child, hearing this, I think is valid. Those words still do sting. I mean, even as we're talking about, I suspect you're uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable, just saying these words out loud.
Exactly. And there's like a difference from reading it on the page versus saying it out loud.
Exactly.
So, thank you so much for talking to me about the book and about like what it does, and I really appreciate it.
Good. I hope it helps with the project.
Yeah, it does.